There's an old saying in Nebraska, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should fear most. In the summer of 2023, the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club learned this lesson the hard way when they decided to target what seemed like an easy mark. A deaf farmer at the Riverwood Farmers Market who they thought would be an ideal victim for their intimidation tactics. What they didn't know was that Jim Walker had spent 23 years as one of America's most decorated Green Berets, with over 180 classified missions in regions the government still won't acknowledge. Quick pause. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We'd love to hear where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. Now, back to our story. The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverwood's town square as Jim Walker carefully arranged his organic produce at his market stall. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, each vegetable placed just so, his keen eyes constantly scanning his surroundings, a habit ingrained from decades of special operations. The hearing aids he wore were barely visible, and most locals had learned to face him while speaking, knowing he read lips with remarkable accuracy. Sheriff Frank Martinez stood near Taylor's Corner Cafe, watching the market come to life. 20 years in law enforcement had taught him to read people, and something about Walker had caught his attention from the day the farmer arrived in Riverwood. The way the older man moved, the methodical way he surveyed his surroundings. This wasn't just some disabled farmer looking for a quiet life. The rumble of motorcycles shattered the morning peace. 3 chrome-plated machines rolled into the square, their riders wearing Iron Wolves patches. Marcus Steele Johnson, the club's president, led them. His eyes fixed on Walker's stall, the deaf farmer continued arranging his produce, seemingly oblivious to their approach. "Hey!" Steele shouted, forgetting or not caring about Walker's disability. "I'm talking to you, old man." Jim continued his work, his back turned to the bikers. Dr. Rachel Chen, buying vegetables at the next stall, watched with growing concern. She'd treated Jim for a minor cut last month and had noticed the scars, too precise, too professional to be farm accidents. Steele grabbed a tomato from Jim's display, crushing it in his gloved hand. The red pulp dripped between his fingers as he finally stepped into Walker's line of sight. The farmer's steel-gray eyes met his, and for a moment, something flickered in that gaze. Something that made Steele take an unconscious step backward. "This is Iron Wolves territory now," Steele said slowly, exaggerating his mouth movements mockingly. "Market fees just went up. For protection, you understand?" Jim's voice, when he spoke, was perfectly modulated. The voice of a man who had learned to speak without being able to hear himself. No fees, no protection needed. Each word was precise, deliberate. Ray Razor Peterson, Steele's second in command, laughed and knocked over a basket of peppers. "Maybe you didn't hear him right," he sneered, emphasizing the taunt. The change in Jim Walker was subtle but profound. His stance shifted slightly, his hands relaxed at his sides, and his eyes, those eyes that had seen more combat than the entire Iron Wolves Club combined, swept the scene with tactical precision. 3 men, he said quietly, 2 armed, left jacket pocket and boot, one at my 6 trying to look intimidating but favoring his right leg. Amateur spacing, poor situational awareness. The laughter died in Steele's throat. This wasn't the reaction they'd expected from their supposedly vulnerable target. "How did you—" Razor started, his hand unconsciously moving toward his jacket. "I was deaf, not blind," Jim replied calmly, "long before you decided to make a mistake this morning." Linda Williams, watching from her craft stall, would later tell Sheriff Martinez that what happened next was almost too fast to follow. Razor reached for his pocket and suddenly Jim Walker was in motion. His movements were economical, precise, the kind of efficiency that only comes from years of close-quarters combat training. In seconds, Razor was face down in a pile of spilled produce, his arm locked behind him at an angle that made him gasp. Steele found himself frozen, caught in a moment of decision, while their third member stood rooted in place, suddenly unsure about everything they'd thought they knew about their target. 23 years in Special Forces, Jim said, his voice still calm, still measured. I learned to read body language better than most people read books. Now I'm going to release your friend, and you're going to leave. When your club asks, what happened? Tell them you made a mistake. Tell them you chose the wrong farmer to harass. He released Razor, stepping back with the same fluid grace he'd shown in the takedown. The three bikers retreated to their motorcycles, their attempted show of force having backfired spectacularly. As they roared away, Sheriff Martinez approached Jim's stall. Could have just told them you were Green Beret from the start, he said, facing the farmer so he could read his lips. Jim smiled slightly, straightening his produce display. Sometimes the quietest lesson is the one they remember most, Sheriff. Dr. Chen, who had witnessed the entire encounter, understood something that the Iron Wolves would soon learn. They hadn't just threatened a disabled farmer. They'd awakened something far more dangerous. A man who had spent decades in the shadows, fighting battles most people would never know about. At the edge of town, Steele gathered his men, his face dark with rage and embarrassment. Call everyone, he ordered Razor. I want every Iron Wolf within 3 states here by tomorrow. That old man just bought himself a war. What the Iron Wolves didn't realize was that Jim Walker had spent his entire military career preparing for wars nobody thought he could win. The quiet farmer was about to teach them why some of America's deadliest soldiers are the ones you never hear coming. As evening settled over Riverwood, word of the morning's confrontation spread through the small farming community like wildfire. At Taylor's Corner Cafe, Bob Taylor wiped down his counter while locals dissected every detail of what had happened at the farmers market. Never seen anything like it, Linda Williams told the gathered crowd, her hands gesturing animatedly. The way Jim moved, it was like watching water flow. Those bikers never stood a chance. Dr. Rachel Chen sat quietly in her usual booth, reviewing Jim Walker's medical file on her tablet. What had initially seemed like routine farm injuries now told a different story. Healed fractures, consistent with combat trauma, scar tissue patterns that spoke of battlefield medicine. Through the window, she watched Sheriff Martinez's patrol. Car rolled past, making another circuit of the suddenly tense town. The bell above the cafe door chimed as Bill Anderson from the hardware store rushed in, his face flushed with urgency. You all need to see this, he said, pointing toward Main Street. They're back, and they brought friends. The rumble of motorcycles filled the air, not just a few this time, but dozens. The Iron Wolves had made good on their threat, calling in members from across 3 states. Chrome gleamed under the setting sun as bikes lined both sides of Main Street, their riders gathering in front of the town hall. Sheriff Frank Martinez watched from his office window, Deputy Kevin Harris fidgeting nervously beside him. Called the state police, Kevin reported. They're stretched thin, say it'll be at least 2 hours before they can get anyone here. Might not matter by then, Martinez replied, checking his sidearm. Through his window, he could see Marcus Steele Johnson holding court in the middle of the gathered bikers, his voice carrying across the suddenly empty street. At Pine Creek Farm, Jim Walker felt the motorcycle's vibrations through the ground. Before he saw them, a lifetime of adapting to his disability had heightened his other senses to extraordinary levels. He stood on his porch, watching dust clouds rise from the convoy of bikes heading toward town, his expression unchanging. Mary Sullivan, his elderly neighbor, pulled up in her battered pickup truck, her face lined with concern. "Jim!" she called, out making sure he could see her face clearly. They're gathering in town. Must be 50 bikes at least. Maybe you should stay out here tonight, let things cool down." Jim's smile was gentle, but his eyes remained hard. "Never been one for hiding, Mary. Besides," he gestured to his property, "got chores to finish." What Mary didn't notice was how Jim had spent the afternoon preparing his farm. To untrained eyes, everything looked normal. Equipment parked in usual spots, gates secured as always. But Jim had arranged everything with tactical precision, creating clear fields of fire, establishing choke points, preparing for possibilities that his neighbors couldn't imagine. In town, the Iron Wolves continued to gather. Ray "Razor" Peterson stood next to Steele, still nursing his wounded pride from the morning's humiliation. "Got word from our Chicago chapter," he reported. "Their guys will be here by midnight. That's another 30 riders." Eric "Tank" Thompson, the club's enforcer, cracked his knuckles with anticipation. "One old deaf farmer, don't care what kind of training he had, numbers don't lie." At the clinic, Dr. Chen received an unexpected visitor. Jim Walker walked in just as she was preparing to close, his movements as deliberate as ever. "Need to ask a favor, Doc," he said, his voice carefully modulated. "Might have some people needing medical attention tonight. Best if you're prepared."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Rachel studied him carefully, noting how he positioned himself with clear sightlines to both exits, another unconscious habit from his military days. "You could leave," she suggested. "No one would blame you." Jim's response was interrupted by Mayor George Wilson bursting into the clinic, his face flushed with panic. "Jim, thank God you're here. The Iron Wolves. Their leader says if you don't meet him at town hall in 1 hour, they'll start destroying businesses. Says they'll teach the town what happens when they harbor someone who disrespects the club." Jim's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance. Dr. Chen, who had treated enough soldiers to recognize combat readiness, saw the subtle transformation. This wasn't just a farmer anymore. This was a Green Beret preparing for operation. "Monsieur," Jim said calmly, "I need you to do something for me. Get everyone off the streets. Tell them to stay inside, away from windows, and record everything. They see, don't interfere, just document." "But the police," Wilson started. "Won't get here in time," Jim finished. "This ends tonight, one way or another." At Taylor's Corner Cafe, Bob Taylor watched the bikers through his windows, their numbers still growing. Joe Richardson, the town mechanic, had barricaded himself in his garage after 3 Iron Wolves had threatened to burn it down. The veterinary clinic, run by Dr. Mark Stevens, had already had its windows broken, a warning of what was to come. Jennifer Parker, the local reporter, was everywhere with her camera, documenting the invasion of her town. She caught the moment Steele sent his ultimatum to Jim through the mayor, caught the growing fear in people's faces, caught the way the Iron Wolves were positioning themselves throughout Riverwood like an occupying force. What no one caught was Jim Walker making his preparations. He moved through town like a ghost, his decades of special operations experience showing in every calculated step. He noted positions, angles, vulnerabilities, seeing the town as what it was about to become, a battlefield. Sheriff Martinez found him behind the hardware store, checking something in his truck. "Got about 40 minutes before their deadline," the sheriff said, making sure Jim could see his face clearly. "State police won't be here in time. You got a plan?" Jim's smile was grim. "Always have a plan, Sheriff. Remember what they taught us in the service. The best weapon isn't the one you carry, it's the one between your ears." "They taught you that in the Green Berets?" "No," Jim replied, his eyes scanning the growing darkness. "Learned that the hard way, in places I can't talk about after I lost my hearing. Had to adapt, had to learn to fight smarter, not harder. These boys," he nodded toward the gathered bikers, They think being deaf makes me vulnerable. They're about to learn what it really means. As darkness settled over Riverwood, the Iron Wolves' deadline approached like an oncoming storm. Steele Johnson paced in front of Town Hall, checking his phone for updates from incoming chapters. Ray Razor Peterson had positioned men at key points throughout the town, the main intersections behind the hardware store, around Taylor's Corner Cafe. "One old deaf man," Steele muttered, watching the town's lights flicker in the growing darkness. "Made us look weak. That ends tonight." Quick pause. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, back to Riverwood. Dr. Rachel Chen worked efficiently in her clinic, preparing for what she feared would come. Through her window she could see bikers patrolling the streets, their leather cuts gleaming under streetlights. Jennifer Parker, the local reporter, slipped inside, her camera clutched protectively. "Got some footage you need to see, Doc," Jennifer said, her voice low. She played back a video showing Iron Wolves unloading something from their saddlebags. Metal pipes, chains, things meant to hurt. At Pine Creek Farm, Jim Walker made his final preparations. His years of special operations had taught him to use every advantage, including ones his opponents thought were weaknesses. Being deaf had forced him to develop extraordinary situational awareness, to read microscopic changes in his environment that others might miss. He felt the vibrations before he saw them. 3 bikes approaching his property, trying to be stealthy in the darkness. Jim smiled slightly. They were following exactly the path he'd anticipated, their headlights off, thinking they were being clever. Tank Thompson led the small group, confident in their numeric advantage. "Check the barn," he ordered in a harsh whisper, forgetting momentarily that their target couldn't hear them anyway. "Boss wants him brought back to town. Macon. Example." The bikers split up, moving with what they thought was tactical precision. Jim watched through his night vision scope, a piece of equipment left over from his service days. Their movement patterns were sloppy, their spacing amateur. They'd watched too many movies, learned nothing about real combat. In town, Sheriff Martinez kept his deputies positioned strategically, documenting everything. Mayor Wilson had barricaded himself in his office, making frantic calls to state officials who seemed unmoved by their plight. Bob Taylor had turned his cafe into an impromptu command center where locals gathered to share information and watch the situation unfold. "Something's happening at Pine Creek Farm," Linda Williams reported, having just driven past. "Saw bikes heading that way, lights off." Mary Sullivan, who lived nearest to Jim's property, called in moments later, heard motorcycles, then nothing. Complete silence. Tank Thompson and his team were about to learn why Jim Walker had survived decades in combat zones despite his disability. The first biker found himself suddenly airborne, caught in a snare, designed to disable without killing, something Jim had learned in courses the government still wouldn't acknowledge. The second rider went down when his bike mysteriously lost traction on what appeared to be a normal patch of dirt. Jim had prepared the ground carefully, using techniques learned in terrains far more hostile than Nebraska farmland. Tank, hearing his men's shouts, turned toward the barn and found himself face to face with Jim Walker, who seemed to materialize from the darkness like a ghost. "3 men," Jim said calmly, his voice carrying in the night air. "Poor tactical approach, no rear security, no awareness of terrain." He moved with liquid grace as Tank reached for a weapon. "You people still don't understand what being deaf taught me." The fight, if it could be called that, was embarrassingly brief. Tank found his years of bar brawls meant nothing against someone trained in close-quarters combat by the world's most elite fighting force. Jim's movements were economical, precise, designed to disable without permanent injury. "Your friends are alive," Jim told the groaning Tank. "They'll have headaches, wounded pride. Could have been worse, much worse." He zip-tied their hands efficiently. Now you're going to deliver a message. In town, Steele Johnson was getting impatient. Tank wasn't answering his phone, and the deadline was approaching. Razor paced nervously, something about the situation feeling wrong. "Maybe we should have brought more guys," he muttered. The sound of a single motorcycle approaching drew everyone's attention. Tank Thompson rode slowly into the town square, his face pale, his usual bravado completely absent. Behind him, tied to their bikes but unhurt, came his two teammates, their machines being controlled remotely through some method none of them understood. "Tell them," Jim's voice came through Tank's phone, which was broadcasting on its speaker. "Tell them what you learned tonight." Tank's voice shook slightly. "He's not just deaf," he reported. "Being deaf made him better. He sees things we don't, moves in ways. It's not natural, Steele. He knew where we'd be before we got there, knew how we'd react." Dr. Chen, watching from her clinic window, saw something in the gathered biker's body language. The first hints of uncertainty, of fear. These men were used to being predators, not prey. Jim Walker appeared at the edge of the town square, moving, with the same fluid grace he'd shown at the market. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly across the sudden silence. 23 years in Special Forces, he said, each word precise. "Lost my hearing in an operation I can't talk about. Taught me to adapt, to see the world differently. You thought being deaf made me weak. Instead, it made me something else entirely." Steele Johnson, his face flushed with rage and embarrassment, started to speak. Jim cut him off with a gesture. "You have one chance," the former Green Beret continued. "Leave Riverwood. Leave these people alone. Or stay and learn why some of America's deadliest soldiers are the ones you never hear coming." Jennifer Parker's camera caught everything. The way the Iron Wolves looked at each other, the subtle shifts in their stance, the growing realization that they weren't facing some helpless old farmer. They were facing someone who had spent decades learning to turn apparent weakness into lethal strength. "This isn't over," Steele growled, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Jim smiled slightly. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is. Check your bikes." One by one, the Iron Wolves discovered what Tank had learned. Their motorcycles had been subtly sabotaged during their posturing. Nothing permanent, nothing obvious, but enough to demonstrate that Jim Walker had been 3 steps ahead of them all night. "How?" Razor demanded. "How did you get to all our bikes without anyone seeing?" "Because you people still don't understand," Jim replied. "Being deaf taught me to move in silence, to see what others miss, to feel what they ignore. Everything you thought was an advantage, your numbers, your noise, your intimidation, they're all weaknesses to someone who learned to fight without relying on sound." As dawn broke over Riverwood, the Iron Wolves regrouped at their makeshift camp on the outskirts of town. Steele Johnson's anger had hardened into something colder, more calculated. The night's humiliation had transformed what started as simple intimidation into something personal. Quick pause. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. Now back to our story. Ki Wanushiwa got word from our contacts in Kansas City, Razor reported, his phone illuminating his face in the early morning light. "They're sending someone, a professional, guy who handles problems." At Taylor's Corner Cafe, Bob Taylor served coffee to Sheriff Martinez, while Dr. Rachel Chen reviewed security footage Jennifer Parker had captured overnight. The images showed Jim Walker's precise movements, his almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings. "Look at this," Dr. Chen pointed to the screen. "The way he moves, it's not just military training. He's using vibrations, air pressure changes, things most people never notice. His disability forced him to develop these skills to survive." Sheriff Martinez nodded grimly. "Question is, will it be enough? Just got word. Iron Wolves called in someone named Victor Kane, former military contractor, specializes in making problems disappear." Outside, the town was quiet but tense. Bill Anderson's hardware store showed signs of overnight vandalism. Broken windows, spray-painted threats. Joe Richardson worked silently in his garage, fixing the subtle damage Jim had done to the bikers' motorcycles, buying time while trying to appear cooperative. At Pine Creek Farm, Jim Walker felt the change in the air before he saw it, the subtle shift in pressure that told him a vehicle was approaching. Not motorcycles this time, something heavier, military grade. Mary Sullivan's truck kicked up dust as she raced up his driveway. "Jim!" she called out, making sure he could see her face. "Black SUVs coming into town, men in tactical gear. They look professional." Jim's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance. He'd seen this before, in places. The government denied existing, private military contractors, men who traded their honor for blood money. "Stay inside today, Mary," he said calmly. "Things might get complicated." In town, Victor Kane's arrival changed the atmosphere immediately. He moved with the precise efficiency of someone trained in special operations, his team spreading out through Riverwood with professional discipline. These weren't amateur bikers anymore. These were men who understood real violence. "Tell me about him," Kane demanded, studying photographs Jennifer Parker had taken. Steele Johnson shifted uncomfortably under the contractor's cold gaze. "Deaf farmer," Steele began. "But he's former Green Beret," Kane interrupted. "I see it. In how he moves, special operations, but there's something else." He studied the footage of Jim's confrontation with Tank's team. The way he uses his disability, he's turned it into an advantage. Interesting. Dr. Chen, treating a young biker for a sprained wrist, overheard Kane's team discussing tactics. Their words made her blood run cold. These men weren't here to intimidate. They were here to eliminate a threat. Jim Walker spent the morning making preparations of his own. His years in combat had taught him to read terrain, to use the environment itself as a weapon. Being deaf had only enhanced these skills, forcing him to develop an almost preternatural awareness of his surroundings. "They're spreading through town," Sheriff Martinez reported, facing Jim directly so he could read his lips. "These aren't regular thugs. They move like military." "Because they are," Jim replied calmly, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Private military contractors, probably Blackwater alumni. They think they're hunters." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "They're wrong." Linda Williams watched from her craft store as Kane's men established observation points throughout town. "They're different from the bikers," she told Bob Taylor. "The way they move, the way they communicate. It's like watching wolves instead of angry dogs." Jennifer Parker's camera captured the transformation of Riverwood. Kane's men had turned the small farming community into what looked like a military operation zone, but they had made one critical mistake. They still thought Jim's deafness was a weakness to exploit rather than a strength to fear. "Your target compensates for his disability with enhanced visual awareness and tactile sensitivity," Kane briefed his team. "Standard approach won't work. We need to overwhelm his adapted senses." What Kane didn't understand was that Jim Walker had spent decades learning to turn sensory deprivation into tactical advantage. In places where darkness was absolute, where sound meant death, he had learned to fight using senses most people never developed. "They're planning something," Deputy Kevin Harris reported, watching Kane's men unload equipment from their vehicles. "Looks like military-grade tech, flashbangs, smoke grenades." Jim nodded slightly. "They think they can disorient me," he said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had faced worse odds. "They don't understand. You can't disorient someone who learned to fight without relying on normal senses." Mary Sullivan, watching from her property, saw Jim begin moving equipment in seemingly random patterns around his farm. To untrained eyes, it looked like normal agricultural work. But Dr. Chen, dropping off medical supplies, recognized something else. He was preparing killing grounds, turning his entire property into a trap. "You could leave," she suggested, making sure he could see her lips clearly. "No one would blame you." Jim's smile was gentle, but his eyes remained hard. 23 years in Special Forces taught me something important," he replied. "Sometimes the best way to protect people is to make the threat understand the true cost of violence." Kane watched through high-powered binoculars as Jim worked. On his farm, "He's preparing the battlefield," he told Steele, "using techniques I've seen before. Your deaf farmer, he's not just Special Forces, he's something else. The way he moves, the way he uses his environment. I've heard stories about operators like him." Steele shifted uneasily. "What kind of stories?" "They called them ghost walkers, specialists in sensory-deprived combat, operators who learn to fight using senses most people don't even know exist. Your farmer didn't just survive losing his hearing, he turned it into a weapon." The midday sun beat down on Riverwood as Victor Kane finalized his tactical approach. His men, all former military with extensive combat experience, moved through their preparations with professional precision. This wasn't going to be a biker brawl. This was a military operation. If you're joining us now, make sure to hit subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. The story is about to intensify. "Sir," one of Kane's operators reported, "surveillance is picking up something strange. Walker's not just working his farm, he's creating defensive positions, but in ways I've never seen before." Kane studied the thermal imaging displays they'd set up in their command vehicle. Jim Walker's movements appeared random to untrained eyes, but Kane recognized the underlying pattern. The deaf farmer was turning his entire property into a sensory trap. At the clinic, Dr. Rachel Chen received an unexpected visit from Jennifer Parker. The local reporter had been documenting everything, and her latest footage revealed something disturbing. "Look at this," Jennifer said, showing Dr. Chen her camera. "Kane's men, they're carrying military-grade equipment, things that shouldn't be available to civilians." Through the clinic window, they watched as more black SUVs arrived, carrying what looked like electronic warfare equipment. Kane was preparing for something big. Sheriff Martinez found Jim Walker at Taylor's Corner Cafe, calmly drinking coffee while keeping perfect situational awareness of his surroundings. "They're bringing in serious hardware," Martinez said, making sure Jim could read his lips clearly. "Good," Jim replied, his voice steady. "Let them think technology can overcome experience. They still don't understand what being deaf taught me about real combat." Bob Taylor, wiping down his counter, watched the interaction with growing concern. Through his windows, he could see Kane's men establishing positions throughout town. Their movements were professional, coordinated, nothing like the chaotic posturing of the Iron Wolves. "Got to ask," Martinez continued, "how did you really lose your hearing?" Jim's eyes remained focused on the street outside, but his expression shifted slightly. "Classified operation," he replied. "Deep in territory we weren't supposed to be in. Enemy had sonic weapons, experimental tech. Lost my team, lost my hearing, but learned something valuable." He turned to face Martinez directly. "Learned that what most people consider a disability can become your strongest asset if you let it." Kane's voice crackled over his team's. "Secure communications. Target has extensive special operations background. Sources suggest he was part of a classified unit specializing in sensory-deprived combat scenarios. Approach with extreme caution." At the hardware store, Bill Anderson watched Kane's men purchasing specific supplies, things that made his blood run cold. "They're building something," he reported to Sheriff Martinez. "Components that could be used for sonic weapons." Linda Williams, whose craft store had become an unofficial observation post, noticed something else. The way Jim moves through town. It's like he sees things before they happen. He's always 3 steps ahead of Kane's surveillance. Mary Sullivan brought Jim his usual grocery delivery, making sure to approach from where he could see her clearly. "They're setting up some kind of equipment around town," she told him. "Big speakers or something." Jim nodded slightly. "They think they can use sound as a weapon against someone who can't hear," he said, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "They're about to learn why that's a mistake." Kane's tactical team began their final preparations as evening approached. Their plan was sophisticated, using multiple sonic devices to create disorienting wave patterns that would overwhelm even a deaf man's adapted senses. What they didn't realize was that Jim Walker had spent decades learning to fight without relying on traditional sensory input. In combat zones where darkness was absolute and sound meant death, he had developed ways of reading his environment that went beyond normal human perception. "Check your targets carefully," Kane instructed his team. Walker's not just using traditional, defensive positions. He's created something else, a way of fighting that turns his disability into an advantage. Dr. Chen, reviewing Jim's medical records, finally understood something crucial. His other senses, she explained to Jennifer Parker, they're not just enhanced. He's developed entirely new ways of processing sensory information. These MRI scans, they show neural pathways I've never seen before. Steele Johnson watched from the Iron Wolves camp as Kane's men deployed their equipment. "All this for one deaf farmer?" he muttered. "Not just a farmer," Kane replied, his voice cold. "Your target spent years in a classified unit that turned sensory deprivation into a combat advantage. The stories about operators like him, they're the ones even other special forces teams fear." Jim Walker felt the vibrations of Kane's equipment being activated. To most people, the high-frequency emissions would be debilitating. But to someone who had learned to fight without sound, who had turned silence into a tactical advantage, it was just another failed attempt to exploit a supposed weakness. "They're starting their operation," Deputy Kevin Harris reported, watching Kane's men move into position. Jim's response was calm, measured. "Good. Let them think technology can overcome experience. Let them think being deaf makes me vulnerable. They're about to learn why some of America's deadliest soldiers are the ones who learn to fight beyond normal senses." If you're invested in this story, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, because the next part shows exactly why you never underestimate someone who turned a disability into their greatest strength. The evening shadows lengthened across Riverwood as Kane's tactical team initiated their operation. High-frequency emitters hummed to life, creating invisible waves of sonic energy designed to disorient and incapacitate. Even the Iron Wolves bikers found themselves backing away from the equipment, unsettled by the barely perceptible vibrations. If you're just joining us, hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. This story is about to demonstrate why some disabilities become the most lethal advantages. "All units in position," crackled Kane's radio. "Sonic disruptors at full capacity, moving to Phase 1. At Taylor's Corner Cafe, Dr. Rachel Chen watched through the window as Kane's men moved with military precision. Bob Taylor had closed early, but kept his lights on as requested by Sheriff Martinez, creating shadows that Jim Walker would later use to his advantage. "They still don't understand," Jim said quietly, standing beside Dr. Chen. His eyes constantly scanned the street, reading subtle changes in air pressure and movement that others would never notice. They think sound is a weapon against someone who learned to fight in silence. Jennifer Parker's camera captured the transformation of Riverwood's main street into what looked like a military operation zone. Kane's men had established multiple firing positions, their equipment casting strange shadows in the dying light. "Target hasn't moved from the cafe," one operator reported. "No sign he's aware of our positioning." Kane's smile was cold. "He's aware," he replied. He's choosing. So let us think we have the advantage. Classic special operations psychology. Steele Johnson watched from his position near the hardware store, increasingly uncertain about what they'd started. The professional precision of Kane's team made the Iron Wolves' previous attempts at intimidation seem amateur and foolish. Jim Walker felt the vibrations change before anyone saw movement. His years of operating without hearing had taught him to read battlefield dynamics in ways that went beyond normal human perception. "They're starting," he said to Sheriff Martinez, who had positioned himself near the cafe's back door. "How can you tell?" Martinez asked, making sure Jim could read his lips. Air pressure changed, ground vibrations shifted. They're moving their main force into what they think are covered positions. Jim's smile was slight but confident. "They still think they're hunting me." Kane's voice came through the town's emergency broadcast system, a psychological tactic meant to unnerve their target. "Mr. Walker, you've impressed everyone with your adaptations, but this ends tonight. We have the technology, the training, and the numbers." In response, Jim Walker simply walked out of the cafe's front door, his movements unhurried and precise. To anyone watching, he appeared completely unaffected by the sonic weapons surrounding him. "Impossible," one of Kane's operators muttered. "Those frequencies should be affecting his balance at minimum." What they didn't realize was that Jim had spent decades learning to fight using senses most people never develop. The very equipment they thought would give them an advantage was providing him with perfect awareness of their positions. "Your sonic weapons create vibration patterns," Jim's voice carried clearly across the street. "Patterns I can read better than you can hear. Want to know where all your men are?" He pointed to various shadows and corners, calling out positions with perfect accuracy. 23 years, learning to fight without sound, taught me to see things you'll never notice. Dr. Chen, watching from the cafe window, saw Kane's men shift uncomfortably. Their professional confidence was wavering, faced with something their training hadn't prepared them for. "All units, execute Pattern Alpha," Kane ordered, initiating their carefully planned takedown sequence. What followed would be talked about in Riverwood for years to come. Kane's men moved with professional precision, but Jim Walker moved like a ghost. Each attempt to corner him failed, as he seemed to anticipate their movements before they made them. "He's not just avoiding us," one operator reported, his voice tense. "He's leading us exactly where he wants us." Jim had turned the town's layout into a tactical advantage. Every alley, every shadow, every corner became part of his strategy. The very sonic weapons, meant to disorient him, instead provided him with perfect battlefield awareness. "Your equipment broadcasts your positions," Jim's voice came from somewhere. "In the darkness, every vibration tells me exactly where you are, what weapons you're carrying, even your heart rates. Being deaf taught me to read battlefields in ways you never imagined." Kane watched through his tactical display as his carefully planned operation began to unravel. His men, all experienced combat veterans, found themselves systematically herded into positions of disadvantage. Jennifer Parker's camera caught glimpses of the action, moments where Jim Walker seemed to materialize from shadows, neutralize threats with precise efficiency, and disappear again. His movements weren't just trained, they were something else. Entirely. "Stand down," Sheriff Martinez called out, seeing the situation deteriorate. "Before this gets worse." But Kane's professional pride had been wounded. He switched to his backup plan, signaling his men to deploy the specialized flashbang grenades they'd brought, designed to create maximum disorientation through multiple sensory channels. What they didn't expect was Jim's response. "Flash bangs won't work," his voice came from the darkness. "Can't disorient someone who learned to fight beyond normal senses, but the vibrations they create, they just help me target you more effectively." The night air in Riverwood crackled with tension as Kane's operation continued to unravel. His Professional operators, men who had conducted missions worldwide, found themselves facing something their training hadn't prepared them for. An opponent who had turned his disability into an unprecedented tactical advantage. If you're just joining us, hit subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. The story is about to reveal why some of America's deadliest warriors are the ones who learned to fight beyond normal limitations. Target is moving through Sector 7, one of Kane's men reported, his voice tense. No visual confirmation, but we can feel the vibrations changing. From her position in the clinic, Dr. Rachel Chen monitored the situation through the security cameras Jennifer Parker had helped set up. Jim Walker moved like liquid shadow, each motion precise and deliberate, using the very equipment meant to disorient him as navigational beacons. "Look at this," Dr. Chen pointed to one screen, showing Jennifer. "The way he moves, he's not just avoiding their sonic weapons. He's using the vibration patterns they create to track their positions." Kane stood in his mobile command center, watching his tactical display with growing frustration. His men were being systematically outmaneuvered by someone who shouldn't even be able to coordinate such precise responses without hearing. "All units, switch to infrared," Kane ordered. "He has to have some limitation we can exploit." Jim's voice came through their communications, somehow having gained access to their secure frequency. "Infrared won't help," he said calmly. 23 years learning to fight without sound taught me something your technology can't match. Ma'am, how to read a battlefield through feelings most people never develop." Sheriff Martinez watched from his office as another of Kane's teams went dark, not injured, but thoroughly neutralized through tactics none of them had seen before. "They still don't understand," he said to Deputy Harris. "Every sense they try to target just gives him another advantage." Bob Taylor had turned his cafe into a makeshift observation post where Linda Williams and Mary Sullivan helped track movement patterns through the town. "Third team just went silent," Linda reported, near the hardware store. "He's not just defending," Mary added, her voice filled with wonder. "He's teaching them something." Steele Johnson and his Iron Wolves watched from their increasingly uncertain position as Kane's professional operation fell apart. The bikers, who had thought to intimidate a deaf farmer, now witnessed something that shook their understanding of strength and weakness. "Your sonic weapons create patterns," Jim's voice echoed through the night. "Vibrations in the air, in the ground, in structures. Patterns most people never notice because they rely too much on hearing. But take away sound, and you learn to feel things others can't imagine." Kane's men found their sophisticated equipment becoming a liability. Every sonic pulse, every high-frequency emission, created feedback patterns that Jim Walker read like a tactical map. He moved through their carefully planned containment with almost supernatural awareness. "Target is anticipating our movements," an operator reported, his professional calm cracking. "He's not just reacting, he's 3 steps ahead of every position change." Dr. Chen, reviewing what she knew about sensory adaptation, finally understood something crucial. His brain rewired itself, she explained to Jennifer Parker. When he lost his hearing, other senses developed in ways neuroscience barely understands. He's not disabled, he's evolved. Jim Walker felt the change in vibration patterns as Kane's men switched tactics, attempting to use their sonic weapons in coordinated pulses. To anyone else, it would have been disorienting. To someone who had learned to fight through feeling rather than hearing, it was like they were painting targets on themselves. "They're getting desperate," he told Sheriff Martinez during a brief moment of contact. "About to make their biggest mistake." "Which is?" Martinez asked, making sure Jim could read his lips. "Thinking technology can overcome experience. They're about to learn why some disabilities become the deadliest advantages." Kane, watching another team go dark, made his decision. All units, converge on target location, maximum sonic output. Let's see him handle multiple frequency layers. What Kane didn't understand was that each layer of sonic interference just gave Jim more information to work with. The very air became alive with patterns only he could read, turning their tactical advantage into a strategic liability. "You should know something," Jim's voice came through their comms again. "In places where sound meant death, I learned to feel things most operators never notice. The way air moves around bodies, the subtle vibrations of equipment, the changes in pressure that tell me exactly where you are and what you're planning." Jennifer Parker's camera caught glimpses of what followed. Moments where Kane's professional operators found themselves engaged by someone who moved with impossible precision, who seemed to anticipate every action before it began. "He's not human," one operator gasped, after being systematically disarmed and disabled. "The way he moves, the things he can sense." The night deepened over Riverwood as Kane's tactical operation descended into chaos. His professional operators, men who had conducted missions across multiple continents, found themselves facing something beyond their training, an opponent who had transformed what they saw as a weakness into an unprecedented form of combat. Awareness. If you're just joining us, hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. We're about to see why some of America's most lethal operators are the ones who learn to fight beyond conventional limitations. "All teams, report positions," Kane ordered through his command net, his voice tight with controlled frustration. The responses painted a picture he'd never encountered in decades of private military operations. "Team 3, inoperative. Team 5 lost contact with target. Team 2, equipment malfunction." From her observation point in the clinic, Dr. Rachel Chen watched through security feeds as Jim Walker systematically dismantled Kane's operation. Each movement was precise, calculated, using their own sonic weapons against them in ways they hadn't thought possible. "Look at this," she told Jennifer Parker, pointing to a monitor. "He's not just avoiding their technology, he's using it to create his own tactical advantage. The vibration patterns from their sonic weapons, he's reading them like we'd read a map." Kane stood in his mobile command center, watching his tactical display with growing disbelief. Years of military experience, millions in advanced equipment, and his entire team was being outmaneuvered by someone who couldn't even hear their communications. "Switch to pattern Delta," Kane ordered. "Full spectrum sonic deployment." Jim's voice came through their supposedly secure channel, calm and measured. "Your equipment broadcasts everything you do," he said. "Every frequency change, every position shift creates patterns I learned to read in places where sound meant death. You're not hiding, you're signaling." Sheriff Martinez watched from his position near Taylor's Corner Cafe as another of Kane's teams went dark. Not injured, just thoroughly neutralized through techniques none of them had seen before. "They still don't understand," he told Deputy Harris. "Everything they're doing just gives him more information to work with." Bob Taylor had turned his cafe into an impromptu command post where Linda Williams and Mary Sullivan tracked movement patterns through the town. "Fourth team just lost contact," Linda reported, "near the hardware store." "He's teaching them something," Mary added, her voice filled with understanding, "about strength and weakness, about how limitations become advantages." Steele Johnson and his Iron Wolves watched from their increasingly uncertain position as Kane's professional operation crumbled. The bikers who had thought to intimidate a deaf farmer now witnessed something that challenged everything they thought. They knew about power. "Your sonic weapons create patterns," Jim's voice echoed through the night. "Vibrations in the air, in the ground, in every structure. Patterns most people never notice because they rely too much on hearing, but take away sound, and you learn to feel things others can't imagine." Kane's men found their sophisticated equipment becoming a liability. Every sonic pulse, every high-frequency emission created feedback patterns that Jim Walker read like a tactical blueprint. He moved through their carefully planned containment with almost supernatural awareness. Target is anticipating every movement, an operator reported, his professional calm cracking. He's not just reacting, he's using our own equipment to track us. Dr. Chen, reviewing what she knew about sensory adaptation, finally understood something crucial. His brain rewired itself, she explained to Jennifer Parker. When he lost his hearing, other senses developed in ways neuroscience barely understands. He's not disabled. He's evolved beyond normal sensory limitations. Jim Walker felt the change in vibration patterns as Kane's men switched tactics, attempting to use their sonic weapons in coordinated pulses. To anyone else, it would have been disorienting. To someone who had learned to fight through feeling rather than hearing, it was like they were painting targets on themselves. "They're about to make their final mistake," he told Sheriff Martinez during a brief moment of contact, about to learn why some disabilities become the deadliest advantages. Kane, watching another team go dark, made his last desperate decision. All units converge on target location, maximum sonic output. Let's see him handle multiple frequency layers. What Kane didn't understand was that each layer of sonic interference just gave Jim more information to work with. The very air became alive with patterns only he could read, turning their tactical advantage into a strategic liability. "Something you should understand?" Jim's voice came through their comms again. "In places where darkness was absolute and sound meant death, I learned to feel things most operators never notice. The way air moves around bodies, the subtle vibrations of equipment, the changes in pressure that tell me exactly where you are and what you're planning." Jennifer Parker's camera caught glimpses of what followed. Moments where Kane's professional operators found themselves engaged by someone who moved with impossible precision, who seemed to anticipate every action before it began. As midnight approached in Riverwood, Kane's operation had transformed from a professional tactical mission into something else entirely. A lesson in how true strength often comes from the most unexpected sources. His operators, all hardened veterans, found themselves facing an opponent who had turned their sophisticated technology against them. If you're joining us now, hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. The story is about to reveal why some warriors become deadliest when forced to adapt beyond normal limitations. All remaining units, Kane's voice carried an edge of desperation, converge on Sector 7, full spectrum deployment. I want everything. We have focused on that position. Dr. Rachel Chen and Jennifer Parker monitored the situation from the clinic's security system. Through multiple camera feeds, they watched Jim Walker move with fluid precision through Kane's carefully planned containment. "He's not just avoiding their attack," Dr. Chen observed. "Look at his movements. He's leading them somewhere specific." Kane stood in his mobile command center, watching his tactical display with growing realization. His men weren't just failing. They were being systematically herded into positions of disadvantage by someone who had transformed a disability into an unprecedented form of combat awareness. "Target is controlling the battlefield," one operator reported, his professional demeanor cracking. "Every move we make, every piece of equipment we deploy, just gives him more tactical information." Bob Taylor had kept his cafe open, serving coffee to Sheriff Martinez and Deputy Harris as they monitored the situation. Through the windows, they could see Kane's men moving with increasing uncertainty, their confidence shaken by encounters with something beyond their training. "Your sonic weapons," Jim's voice came through their secure communications again. "They create patterns in the air, in the ground, patterns most people never notice because they rely too much on normal senses. But take away hearing, and you learn to feel things others can't imagine. Linda Williams, watching from her craft store position, saw Kane's men begin to bunch together, a tactical mistake born of growing fear. "They're clustering," she reported through the civilian network Jim had established. "Lost their professional spacing. Because they're scared," Mary Sullivan added from her observation post. "Not just of him, but of what he represents, someone who turned what they thought was a weakness into something they can't counter." Steele Johnson and his Iron Wolves watched from their increasingly marginalized position as Kane's professional operation continued to unravel. The bikers who had started this confrontation now witnessed something that challenged their entire understanding of strength and vulnerability. "He's not human," one of Kane's operators gasped after being systematically disarmed and disabled. "The way he moves, the things he can sense. It's like fighting a ghost." Jim Walker felt the change in vibration patterns as Kane's men made their final push. Their sophisticated equipment, meant to disorient and incapacitate, instead provided him with perfect battlefield awareness. "You should understand something," he transmitted through their own communication system. "In places where darkness was absolute and sound meant death, I learned to read battlefields in ways most operators never imagine. Every vibration tells a story, your positions, your equipment, even your heart rates." Kane watched his tactical display as another team went dark. "How?" he demanded. "How are you doing this?" "Because you still think being deaf is a weakness," Jim replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "You don't understand what losing one sense taught me about using all the others, about feeling things most people never notice." Dr. Chen, reviewing security footage with Jennifer Parker, pointed to a particular sequence. "Look at how he moves," she said. "He's not just responding to their actions. He's reading the subtle changes in air pressure, the vibrations their equipment creates, even the way their movements affect the ground beneath them." Sheriff Martinez watched as Jim systematically dismantled Kane's remaining teams. Each encounter was brief, precise, designed not to injure, but to demonstrate something profound about strength and adaptation. "You trained with the best equipment," Jim's voice carried through the night. "Learned to rely on technology and normal senses. But I learned to fight in places where technology failed, where normal senses weren't enough. That's what you're really facing, not a disability, but an evolution." Kane made his final mistake, ordering his remaining operators to concentrate their sonic weapons at maximum power. What he didn't understand was that each layer of sonic interference just gave Jim more patterns to read, more information to process through senses most people never develop. In the hours before dawn, Riverwood bore witness to the final stages of a confrontation that would challenge everything its residents thought they knew about strength and adaptation. Kane's remaining operators, their professional confidence shattered, found themselves facing an opponent who had turned their own sophisticated technology into a weapon against them. If you're joining us now, hit subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. We're about to see the culmination of why some warriors become unstoppable when forced to adapt beyond normal limitations. "All remaining units," Kane's voice carried across their secure channel, "fall back to position Alpha, regroup and prepare for final engagement." In the clinic, Dr. Rachel Chen and Jennifer Parker watched through security feeds as Jim Walker moved with deadly precision through the town's darkened streets. Each movement was calculated, using the vibrations from Kane's sonic weapons to track and target their positions. "He's not just fighting them," Dr. Chen observed, pointing to a monitor. "He's demonstrating something about adaptation, about turning perceived weakness into unprecedented strength." Kane stood in his mobile command center, watching his tactical display with growing comprehension. His entire operation, backed by millions in equipment and years of combined combat experience, was being systematically dismantled by someone who had learned to fight beyond normal human limitations. Target is herding units 7 and 9 toward the market square, an operator reported, his voice tense. It's like he can see everything, feel everything. Sheriff Martinez and Deputy Harris maintained their observation position near Taylor's Corner Cafe, where Bob Taylor kept coffee, flowing for the impromptu command post. Through the windows, they watched Kane's professional operators move with increasing desperation. "Your technology broadcasts everything," Jim's voice emerged from their own communications. "Every frequency, every movement creates patterns I learned to read in places where normal senses weren't enough. You're not hiding, you're painting targets on yourselves." Linda Williams and Mary Sullivan coordinated civilian observations from their positions, tracking movement patterns through the town. "They're losing their professional discipline," Linda reported, "breaking formation, clustering together. Because they're facing something their training never prepared them for," Mary added, "someone who turned disability into an advantage they can't counter." Steele Johnson and his Iron Wolves watched from the periphery as their hired professional force crumbled. The bikers who had started this confrontation now witnessed a demonstration of true strength that made their initial intimidation attempts seem childish. "He's using our own equipment against us," one of Kane's operators gasped after another failed engagement. "Every sonic pulse, every frequency we deploy just gives him more information to work with." Jim Walker felt the shift in vibration patterns as Kane's men prepared their final push. Their sophisticated technology, meant to disorient and incapacitate, instead provided him with perfect battlefield awareness. "You should understand something fundamental," he transmitted through their compromised communications. "When you lose, one sense you don't just enhance the others, you develop entirely new ways of perceiving the world, ways most people never imagined possible." Kane watched his tactical display as his last coordinated teams went dark. "Final option," he ordered. "Maximum sonic deployment, all frequencies, all remaining units." "Because you still don't understand," Jim's voice came through their secure channel. "You think technology can overcome adaptation. But I learned to fight in places where technology failed, where survival meant developing senses beyond normal human perception." Dr. Chen, analyzing the pattern of engagements with Jennifer Parker, pointed to a particular sequence. "Look at his movements," she said. "He's not just responding to their actions. He's reading subtle changes in air pressure, ground vibrations, even the electromagnetic fields their equipment generates." The night air hummed with the combined output of Kane's remaining sonic weapons, creating patterns of vibration that most would find debilitating. But to Jim Walker, who had learned to fight through feeling rather than hearing, it was like they were illuminating themselves in the darkness. "This ends now," Kane transmitted, his professional demeanor finally cracking. "All units converge. On target position, maximum output, all remaining equipment." What followed would be talked about in Riverwood for years to come. Jim Walker moved through Kane's final offensive like a ghost, each movement precise and deliberate, using their own technology to track and neutralize them with almost supernatural efficiency. As the first hints of dawn began to touch the horizon, Riverwood witnessed the final phase of a confrontation that would redefine its understanding of strength and adaptation. Kane's remaining operators, their professional confidence completely shattered, faced the culmination of their miscalculation. If you're just joining us, hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. We're about to witness why underestimating someone's perceived disability can be the last mistake you ever make. All remaining units, Kane's Voice trembled slightly over their compromised communications. Converge on the town square. This is our last play. Dr. Rachel Chen and Jennifer Parker monitored the situation from their position in the clinic, watching through multiple security feeds as Jim Walker moved with lethal precision through the pre-dawn darkness. Each movement was calculated, using the very vibrations from Kane's sonic weapons to track and target their positions. "He's not just winning," Dr. Chen observed, pointing to a particular monitor. "He's teaching them something fundamental about adaptation and survival." In his mobile command center, Kane watched his tactical display with a mix of professional awe and personal fear. His entire operation, backed by state-of-the-art technology and years of combat experience, had been systematically dismantled by someone who had turned a supposed disability into an unprecedented tactical advantage. "Your equipment betrays you," Jim's voice emerged from their own communication system. "Every frequency, every vibration tells me exactly where you are, what you're planning, even your emotional state. You broadcast everything to someone who learned to feel what others can't even perceive." Bob Taylor's Cafe had become the unofficial command center, where Sheriff Martinez and Deputy Harris coordinated with civilian observers. Through the windows, they watched Kane's professional operators move with increasing desperation. "They're making their final mistake," Jim told Martinez during a brief moment of contact, about to learn why some disabilities become the deadliest advantages. Linda Williams and Mary Sullivan maintained their observation positions, tracking movement patterns through the town. "They've lost all tactical discipline," Linda reported, "moving like scared men, not professionals." "Because they're facing something beyond their understanding," Mary added. "Someone who turned what they thought was a weakness into something they can't counter." Steele Johnson and his Iron Wolves watched from their increasingly marginalized position as their hired professional force crumbled. The bikers who had started this confrontation now witnessed a demonstration of true strength that made their initial intimidation attempts seem childish. "He's reading us like a book," one of Kane's operators gasped after another failed engagement. "Everything we do, every piece of equipment we use, just gives him more tactical advantage." Jim Walker felt the shift in vibration patterns as Kane's men prepared their final desperate push. Their sophisticated technology, meant to disorient and incapacitate, instead provided him with perfect battlefield awareness. "You should understand something crucial," he transmitted through their compromised communications. "When you lose one sense, you don't just enhance the others. You develop entirely new ways of perceiving reality. Ways most people never imagine possible." Dr. Chen, analyzing the pattern of engagements with Jennifer Parker, pointed to a particular sequence. "Look at his movements," she said. "He's not just responding to their actions, he's reading subtle changes in air pressure, ground, vibrations, even the electromagnetic fields their equipment generates." Kane made his final desperate move. "All remaining units, maximum sonic output, every piece of equipment we have left focused on his position." What they didn't understand was that each layer of sonic interference just gave Jim more patterns to read, more information to process through senses most people never develop. He moved through their final offensive like a ghost, each movement precise and deliberate. "Your sonic weapons create patterns," Jim's voice carried across their secure channel. "Vibrations in the air, in the ground, in every structure. Patterns most people never notice because they rely too much on hearing. But take away sound, and you learn to feel things others can't imagine." The night air hummed with the combined output of Kane's remaining sonic weapons, creating patterns of vibration that most would find debilitating. But to Jim Walker, who had learned to fight through feeling rather than hearing, it was like they were illuminating themselves in the darkness. "Target is neutralizing units 3 and 4. an operator reported, his professional calm finally breaking. "He's not just fighting us, he's making us look like amateurs." The first rays of sunlight touched Riverwood's town square as Kane's operation reached its final desperate moments. His remaining operators, their professional confidence completely shattered, faced the culmination of their fatal miscalculation. If you're just joining us, hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. We're about to witness the powerful conclusion of why underestimating someone's perceived disability can be the last mistake you ever make. All units, final protocol. Kane's voice cracked over their compromised communications. Everything we have left. One last push. Indeed, in the clinic, Dr. Rachel Chen and Jennifer Parker watched through security feeds as Jim Walker moved with deadly precision through the growing light. Each movement was calculated, using years of adaptation and training to turn their own technology against them. "It's not just about winning anymore," Dr. Chen observed, studying the footage. "He's showing them something fundamental about strength and adaptation." Kane stood in his mobile command center, watching his tactical display with dawning comprehension. His entire operation, backed by millions in equipment and years of combat experience, had been systematically dismantled by someone who had turned a supposed disability into an unprecedented tactical advantage. "Your final mistake," Jim's voice, emerged from their own communications, was thinking technology could overcome experience. "You never understood what losing my hearing really taught me." Bob Taylor kept his cafe open as an unofficial command center, where Sheriff Martinez and Deputy Harris coordinated with civilian observers. Through the windows, they watched Kane's last remaining operators move with the desperation of men who had lost not just a fight, but an entire understanding of combat. "He's finishing this," Martinez said, watching Jim systematically dismantle Kane's remaining forces. Not with violence, but with a lesson they'll never forget. Linda Williams and Mary Sullivan maintained their observation posts, documenting every moment of the final confrontation. "They're completely broken," Linda reported. "Their professional training means nothing now, because they're facing something beyond their understanding," Mary added. "Someone who turned what they thought was a weakness into something they can't comprehend." Steele Johnson and his Iron Wolves watched from the periphery as their hired professional force faced its final moments. The bikers who had started this confrontation now witnessed a demonstration of true strength that would change their understanding forever. "He sees things we can't even imagine," one of Kane's last operators gasped after being systematically disabled. "Feels things we can't even perceive." Jim Walker felt the shift in vibration patterns as Kane made his final desperate move. The sophisticated technology meant to incapacitate instead provided him with perfect battlefield awareness. "You should understand something fundamental," he transmitted through their compromised systems. "When you lose one sense, you don't just enhance the others, you develop entirely new ways of perceiving reality, ways most people never imagined possible." The morning air hummed with the combined output of Kane's remaining sonic weapons, creating patterns of vibration that most would find debilitating. But to Jim Walker, who had learned to fight through feeling rather than hearing, it was like they were painting targets on themselves. "Target is, he's everywhere," the last operator reported before going silent. "We never stood a chance." As the sun fully rose over Riverwood, Kane found himself alone in his command center, his entire operation systematically dismantled. Jim Walker appeared at his door, moving with the same fluid grace that had defined every moment of the confrontation. 23 years in Special Forces, Jim said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Lost my hearing in an operation I can't talk about. But what I gained was something far more valuable. an understanding that our greatest weaknesses can become our strongest advantages. The town of Riverwood would never forget the lesson they witnessed that night.